All right, I think I'm gonna get started. And then we'll just keep an eye if anyone else joins us on the waiting room, we'll let them in. But just in the interest of time, I want to make sure we have ample time to get folks out of here earlier or at least on time. So hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sarah Tatarczyk. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I am a regional planner with the Rockingham Planning Commission, and I'm working on the regional housing needs assessment. I've been with the RPC for less than a year, but maybe about 10 months or so at this point. And I've been sort of on the ground with the regional housing needs assessment since day one. The purpose of this event is really to make sure that we have ample time to hear from the folks in our communities as far as housing goes. So, you know, we've kind of been doing some outreach along the way, which included a municipal questionnaire that should have gone out to all the folks on this call, that went out to all of our planning staff and planning boards, select boards, to kind of get a sense of what's going on the ground in your communities in regards to housing. And we did get some responses, but not a ton. And then back in May, we also co-hosted a sort of roundtable event with the Extra Housing Advisory Committee and the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast, where we actually had really great turnout of folks from our communities. We had, planning board members there, we had commissioners there, some planning staff. And that event, which I have the recording to, if anyone's interested after the fact, I can certainly send it out as a follow-up, included sort of a panel of guests. We had the city of Dover speak, we had local business owners speak, the owner of Las Olas, developer, we had Eric Chinberg there as well. And we sort of had a presentation of sort of the state of housing, and then a chance for folks to ask questions. And we ended up not necessarily having enough time to answer all of the questions and listen to all the comments. We ended up cutting people off after, I think it was like 40 minutes or 35 minutes of Q&A. So out of that event, I kind of started to think like, okay, we need to hear a little bit more from our communities exactly to understand what's going on. Specifically in the Rockingham Planning Commission region. So that's sort of what spurred this focus group. I really want to get a chance to hear from you guys. So I'm going to try to speak as little as possible. I have a brief presentation, which I'm going to go through, that sort of just gives you a brief overview of what the regional housing needs assessment is. And then I'm going to present some of our findings that we just finished wrapping up the summaries for 2 of our surveys that we released this past spring, trying to keep that as brief as possible. And then I'm going to sort of open up the room for discussion. And I have some prompts that will hopefully help us get started, but I really want to make sure that we have ample time to actually hear from everyone on this call. So before I get started with my presentation, I would love to just go around the room and have folks just introduce themselves, say their name, position, what community that they're from, and then I'll start my PowerPoint. And also just a side note for everybody, we are recording this. I'm hoping to sort of collect all of the notes and the comments from this session and have those as part of our overall public outreach summary that will be in the regional housing needs assessment document at the end of the day. So just so that folks know this is being recorded. So I'll get started. I'll call you guys out as I see the list on my screen just to keep things organized, and we'll go from there. So I'll start with Sarah Reitzman.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Sarah Reitzman. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator at New Hampshire Housing.
Awesome. Jen Rowden.
I'm Jen Rowden. I'm the Land Use Program Manager here at Rockingham Planning Commission.
Beth.
Hello, everyone. I'm Beth Moreau. I am a commissioner for the Rockingham Planning Commission and a counselor with Portsmouth.
And Karen Anderson.
Karen Anderson from the town of Hampton Falls, and I'm the town administrator.
Peter Coffin.
Yeah, Peter Coffin. I'm a Kingston rep to the RPC and Planning Board and ZBA.
Kim.
Hello, I'm Kim Reed. I'm the Planning and Zoning Administrator from the town of Rye.
Kara,
Hello, I'm the new land use assistant with the town of Rye as well.
and Leanne.
Leanne Minor, Land Use Administrator from Fremont, New Hampshire, and Commissioner.
Awesome. And I think that is everyone. So let me make sure my technology works and that I can share my screen. Jen, do you mind allowing me to share screen just since I made you the host?
She's muted, so.
Oh, okay. All right, let's see. Is that the full slideshow? Are you guys seeing that? Full slides, yep. Okay, great. I see some nods. Okay. Get all my, too many screens up. Hang on. Okay, great. So as you all know, we're here for the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Municipal Focus Group. Let me figure out how to change the slide. Awesome. So welcome and introductions. We just went over that. As I mentioned, we'll go through sort of a what we've heard session from the survey summaries. I'm happy to answer any questions on those, but I might have you guys hold questions until I get through both of the summaries really quickly, just in the interest of time. And just as a heads up, after I present these summaries, we will also have our full reports for those surveys up on our project webpage, which I have the link for as well. I can share after this as a follow-up to this session. And those will be posted probably early next week as we just finalize the documents. And then they'll also be in the appendix of the final housing needs assessment. So then I'm hoping to open up the floor to you all with some questions. Really want to get a sense of sort of this, like, where is your community as far as housing? What conversations are you guys having? What's the big picture? And then start to dig a little bit deeper into sort of those challenges and opportunities that you might be seeing. So constraints on housing development and things of that nature. I'd love to get a sense of sort of development trends. So what has development looked like over 5 years in your community, and what are you starting to see? Are things shifting or changing? And then lastly, I put land use policies and regulations, but really just I have some questions specifically that have to do with policies and regulations specific to housing. And then we'll talk about next steps and wrap up. So many of you guys have probably seen this slide before if you've seen me present on the housing needs assessment at any point in the last 10 months or so. So what is a regional housing needs assessment for those who haven't been a part of any of these sessions thus far? So this is going to be a planning document. The goal is to provide those current regional and local data on housing trends and needs. So we're making sure that we have the most up-to-date data as possible, and really looking at regional as well as local for each of our communities. We'll be identifying housing opportunities and barriers for population across all income levels and all demographics within our communities. And then it will start to discuss solutions and gather resources for our communities to address housing barriers. And I say that because, I say we'll start to, it's not going to be a silver bullet necessarily. It's really providing sort of a state of the union. Where are we at in our region? And then we're going to start to, develop some potential solutions that aren't necessarily going to be a one size fits all, but might be able to help our communities move the needle forward a little bit. And then lastly, the housing needs assessment, as I said, it'll be a tool for communities to utilize really in those local discussions when housing is coming up. As part of the document, we are also developing a toolbox, which will compile all of these resources into one place. And we're actually working with all the 9 RPCs across the state, sort of on a coordination of this project. So all 9 RPCs are doing a housing needs assessment at the same time. And this toolbox will be created for the whole state. There's actually going to be a third-party consultant who is going to be working on that toolbox in the first, or I guess in the in the first half of the 2023 calendar year. That will be really developed and fleshed out. So what have we been working on as far as the housing needs assessment? So as I mentioned, this has really been a statewide coordinated effort. So we've been working with the Office of Planning and Development, and all 9 RPCs have been meeting on a call. I think we're meeting monthly at this point. In the beginning, it was bi-weekly, to really make sure that each regional housing needs assessment in each region is, similar, right? So we've kind of developed a common framework and methodology across the state that we're all utilizing. But at the end of the day, each RPC has the flexibility and the freedom to sort of create their own outreach plan and final document at the end of the day. So we've been doing quite a bit of public participation. Folks have probably seen something about our surveys. So as I mentioned, we had that municipal questionnaire that went out to hopefully all the folks on this call at least, as well as all of our other regions. We also had released a community survey, which is one of the ones I'm going to go over the results of today. We released an employer survey, and we also just have the results coming in of a statewide social service provider survey, which the results will be published in the coming weeks for. And then we're also utilizing some statewide resources. So there's been quite a bit of developer engagement that's been happening on a state level by New Hampshire Housing and the Office of Planning and Development. And we are sort of taking some of those key findings and building off of them as we do our developer engagement. And then similarly, there is a New Hampshire Housing annual rental survey that I believe the results have recently come in or coming in soon. And that's also going to be a tool that we're going to leverage, which was a survey that was released statewide. We have on the RPC website a hosted project specific page, which is the place that you can go to learn more, where we hosted all of the links to these surveys and where we'll be hosting any updated materials as they come out. And we're sort of currently underway producing and starting to analyze all of our data. So this report will have 83 plus unique data metrics that we're going to be including in it. And we are currently through sort of a statewide attack it all, pulling all of those data metrics and starting to format them specifically for our region so that we have the raw data that we can then analyze and format for our final report. And then this summer, early fall, we're starting to really wrap up that stakeholder engagement and public participation as part of these calls. The hope is, or the plan is, to have the final document released by the end of December of 2022 of this year. Okay, so the community survey, as I mentioned, we finally finished up our summary of the 2 surveys, community and employer survey. So just so folks know, the community survey was distributed via our town, so it did go out to town staff to hopefully disseminate across their social media pages and town web pages and things of that nature. The RPC pushed it out through their social media as well as the newsletter and our webpage. And then there were sort of a lot of word of mouth announcements that went on at various municipal board meetings and things of that nature. We had about 329 responses. With a little nudging, we did receive representation from all 27 RPC communities, which was great. And then starting to really get into those results. So one of the purposes of this survey was to really start to understand community perception on housing as well as community need. So it wasn't necessarily just to try to understand, what type of housing are people living in, but it was also to try to understand, how much of their household income is going towards their housing expenses. What type of housing do they want to be living in? What's important to them when they're looking for new housing? So one of the things that is important to note is who's taking this survey, and are they looking for new housing, or have they been living in their existing housing for quite some time? Do they own their home with a mortgage, without a mortgage? Are they living in a single family home versus, renting with roommates or family members, things of that nature. So we actually did receive about a quarter of the respondents were actively seeking a new place to live. And I think that that's important to note because often folks who are actively sort of in the housing market today have a different perspective of folks that have maybe lived in their house for quite some time and haven't necessarily had to be a part of the housing market actively in recent years. We also had a majority of folks who responded state that they own their home either with or without a mortgage, so about 73%. We had the inverse of that, so 27% of respondents stated that they live in a different housing situation, and that could have included renting, living with family or roommates, or that they don't currently have permanent housing. So we actually did have 4 respondents who stated that they don't currently have a permanent housing situation. So as I mentioned, one of the top things that we asked was about housing preference. So overwhelmingly, which kind of surprised me a little bit, I guess it probably shouldn't have, but regardless of whether or not the respondent was actively seeking new housing or not looking for new housing, single family homes was identified as the top housing type preference. So when we asked, what type of housing would you prefer to be living in? We listed out single family, multifamily of different sizes, townhouses, row houses, ADUs, age-restricted housing, supportive housing. Single family home was overwhelmingly selected as the top. Probably not so surprisingly, of those not seeking new housing, 83% of folks said that they prefer to live in a single family home. But of those folks who are actively seeking new housing, which you can see we broke out in this table below here, 65% said that they prefer to be in single family homes. And then there was quite a bit of sort of diverse mix of the different types of housing that folks would prefer to live in. When we asked what the housing characteristics were the most important when they were going to choose what neighborhood they were going to live in, overwhelmingly the top 2 answers were safety and affordability. Lower ranked priorities ended up being proximity to public transportation, as well as being located near where the respondent grew up. And then we asked about sort of housing costs and challenges. So this gets into that housing need. One relatively staggering number that I thought it was kind of staggering that we found. So we asked folks to please select the statement that best describes your housing costs, which includes mortgage or rent, utilities, insurance, and property taxes. And we asked them how much of their total household income was going towards those housing costs. And we had 42% state that their housing costs were over 30%. This number is important to point out because affordable, quote unquote, affordable as deemed by HUD is that a household must pay less than 30% of their total household income to their housing expenses. So stating that, a significant portion of folks that responded to this survey are not living in quote unquote affordable housing per HUD standards. And 91% stated that the greatest housing challenge facing their community, so not necessarily them, but their community, was cost of housing or rent and availability of housing. So going back to sort of that housing preference of also having it be an affordable neighborhood. And then we asked folks what type of housing are missing in your community. And I took those comments and I sort of put them in a word cloud where the more folks said a certain word, the larger the word ends up on this cloud. Multifamily, small, and affordable were sort of the overwhelming statements that folks had. There was quite a few comments about, yes, folks stated that they prefer to be living in single family homes, but there were quite a few open-ended responses that talked about, having smaller single family homes available to folks to be able to have an option as. Okay, so the major key themes that we pulled out. So when it came to demand, majority of respondents, 76%, stated that they agree that their current housing meets their needs today. But almost 40%, 39%, stated that they disagreed with the statement that their current housing will meet their needs for the next 10 years. So that's kind of telling to say that folks are to some extent understanding that their current housing is not going to be their future housing for 10 plus years. Affordability, this was definitely a key theme, as I stated before. So, oh, sorry, we've got people entering. Do a quick, hi Nancy, hi Jackie, just to give you guys an update on where we are. I'm just presenting the key findings for the community survey. And then I'm going to go through our employer survey results as well, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. Thanks for joining. So as I mentioned before, affordability was certainly a key factor that folks were taking into consideration, and something that was on the top of mind of folks filling out the survey. When we asked folks about certain factors being an impact on one's ability to stay in their community, cost of housing was selected as having a significant impact on about 58% of the respondents' ability to stay in their community. In regards to supply and future need, so 83% of participants stated that there is a need for additional moderate income housing units in their community. Much less stated the same thing for luxury housing, affordable housing, low income housing was a little bit higher, but moderate income housing was really the key answer that was selected as the most need. And then, as I said, interestingly enough, whether actively seeking new housing or not, single family homes were selected definitely as the preferred housing type. So that's the community survey. I'm going to go briefly the employer survey. I tried to keep it a little bit more brief, but I thought it was interesting that we had their responses, so I figured I'd definitely share them with you folks. So for we actually had just under 200 responses, which I was really happy with. I did not think that we would get so many employers to fill out the survey. We distributed the survey via the Secretary of State's Businesses in Good Standing list. So it did go out to 15,000 employers in the Rockingham Planning Commission's region, but we got almost 200 of them to respond. So it's pretty good. And we had participation from businesses located in 22 of the RPC's 27 communities, though it is noted that oftentimes a lot of these businesses provide services across municipal boundaries. So the objective of this survey was to try to further understand how and if housing conditions stand in the way of employers attracting and retaining employees. What types of housing solutions are most appealing to employers and employees, if any, and what housing solutions would businesses consider supporting in order to alleviate the current housing pressure on their employees. So housing and employees. So housing availability. It was interesting just to try to understand the perception of, are employees acknowledging or really feeling the housing crisis in their everyday operations and in their ability to attract those employees. Just under 70% of employers identified that the availability of housing in their community has very limited housing options. 56% of employers acknowledge that a housing supply shortage impacts their ability to attract or keep workers. And the cost of housing was selected by over 50% of respondents as having a high impact on their ability to attract and retain workers. When we asked about sort of housing solutions, the three housing, housing strategies, I would say, the three housing strategies that seem to be implemented, if at all, it was overwhelmingly that employers were not necessarily practicing or implementing any, specific housing strategies like homebuyer education or, providing subsidized housing or, operating their own housing for their employees, things of that nature. But homebuyer education, moving cost assistance, and cash contributions were three of the most utilized strategies, although I say most with a grain of salt. I think it was like 4 to 7% of employers were utilizing one of these three strategies. 26% of employers agreed that their company has a role in helping to address the New Hampshire housing issue as it relates to employee attraction and retention. So that's really interesting. You know, we have over 50% of those who took the survey acknowledging that the housing supply shortage and the cost of housing were impacting their ability to attract and retain quality workforce, but only a quarter of those who responded really thought that it was their role as an employer in the region to sort of assist and provide additional strategies. And then the key themes that pulled out of the employer survey, I thought the remote work question was really interesting. So I know with COVID-19, a lot of folks are working remote a lot of the time. I'm currently remote. We actually got sort of the opposite response. So 79% of employers stated that less than 25% of employees work from home periodically, and 75% of employers stated that less than 25% of employees work from home regularly. So meaning that majority of their employees are not working from home most of the time. So even though we talk about remote work being such a prevalent thing, it's either maybe not so much of a prevalent thing for certain industries, and maybe that's just by nature of sort of who engaged with this survey, or maybe it's becoming a thing that's sort of phased out. There was one open-ended comment that talked about, you know, their employees were able to now work remote post sort of pandemic world. They enjoy the flexibility of not having to commute 30 to 45 minutes a day. But now those employees aren't necessarily getting that face time and ability to learn from senior colleagues, right, in the industry. So it's sort of not a win-win situation either direction, which I thought was an interesting comment. So housing supply shortages, so as I mentioned, quite a bit of employers identified that housing supply impacts them, the shortage impacts them, but that it's not necessarily a role for their company to address those issues. But some employers, or excuse me, a lot of employers that took the survey based off of open answered comments did recognize that housing is a challenge that's impacting not only low income, but also moderate income earning employees. And then lastly, there were quite a few open-ended comments as well that were talking about sort of some innovative solutions. So, you know, even though it didn't necessarily show up in our percentage of how many employers were utilizing certain housing strategies, there were quite a few open-ended comments that were talking about, you know, wanting to provide housing assistance or addressing other challenges such as childcare, which relates to the housing situation, or advocating and encouraging building practices that are maybe more energy efficient, that can reduce the utilities cost for lower income households, you know, as part of their overall household costs. So that was the employer survey. I'm happy to answer. I don't know if it makes sense, probably to take a moment to answer any questions or comments on the, sorry, I'm skipping ahead on my slides. Any questions or comments on the surveys? And then I'd love to sort of open up the floor to the greater room to discuss housing in our communities.
I have a question, Sarah. One of the things that you said that jumped out at me was that 26% of employers agree that their company has a role in helping to address the housing crisis. And I think what I'm wondering is if there are any or what examples were given to them. I'm wondering if there's sort of if we can differentiate between, you know, there are employers who are doing things like financially investing in housing, contributing to affordable housing funds, like in the Upper Valley, or like building their own housing, like in the case of Harmony Place, which is a lot to ask of an employer that doesn't do that. But I'm wondering if like some of those employers might have been answering with or without like advocacy on their mind, which is something that employers can do and is definitely a role of theirs.
Yeah, we get so the options we gave them when we asked that question were down payment and or closing cost assistance, rent subsidies, gap financing, homebuyer education, moving cost assistance, cash contributions, land donation, construction financing, low-income housing tax credit investments, and employer-operated housing. So sort of running the spectrum. And we did ask, are you implementing any of these? Or are you interested in learning about implementing them? And there was a little bit more interest in learning more about some of these options and how they
Okay.
might be able to implement them.
Thanks.
Any other questions on the survey just before we move on to my question?
Yeah, on the surveys, was it broken out by types of community? I know you said all 27 communities responded, but my sense is that in places like ours, Kingston, which is mostly single family residential, whether it's rural residential or single family, it's going to be mostly preferred single family housing, whereas someplace like Portsmouth or Dover, well, Portsmouth, I guess, in our communities, I would think apartments and things like that would be more common. So is it broken out that way by city size?
It is. Yeah, the full summary report does have a chart that shows how many responses per community were submitted. And the responses were relatively representative of the percentage of Kingston as it relates to the greater region. There were a couple outliers there, but generally it was relatively represented. But that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a robust showing from some of the smaller communities in our region. So I think it would potentially differ if we had looked at specifically community by community. Our analysis did not go as far as to look at what did folks in Kingston say specifically versus folks in Exeter. But that's certainly something that we could do, I think, as a follow-up analysis, post the publishing of the housing needs assessment, if there's specific communities that are interested in looking at their survey results only.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, none so far. So I'm just going to pause a minute and I'm going to let Jackie and Nancy introduce themselves since they joined while we were kind of in the middle of the presentation and missed our introductions, if you guys don't mind. Jackie, do you mind going first and just saying your name, what community you're from, and what your position is?
Sure. So I live in Rye, and I am a state representative for Rye. I'm also on the Rockingham Planning. I'm a commissioner for the Rockingham Planning Commission, and I serve on the Rye Conservation Commission.
Thanks, Jackie. And then Nancy, if you don't mind, I'll let you introduce yourself as well. If Nancy's there.
She put a message in the chat. She doesn't have video or audio.
Oh, that's okay. Where did my... Oh, so Nancy lives in Exeter. She's on the select board. And then she's also the select board rep to the Housing Advisory Committee. Thanks, Nancy. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. And just so we can see each other for sort of the discussion piece. So to kick off the discussion, as I mentioned, the purpose of this call is to really hear from you guys and hear a little bit about what's happening in your communities. And just a reminder to those who weren't at the introduction, we are recording this meeting. We can then gather and collect these notes so that we can use them as part of our final sort of outreach summary. And we also do have a second session that's going to have the exact same agenda as this one next week, next Thursday. So if anyone is interested, has folks who they knew were interested but couldn't make this time, there's another opportunity. So as I open up the floor to all of you folks, sort of my first topic is housing in your community, big picture. So my first question to kick things off is, if folks could describe housing in their community and their municipality in one word, what would that be? should have made this part of the introduction. Beth?
Expensive.
This is Kim Reed from Rye, and I'm a native, born and native, and used to be a really nice mix, but recently I've been feeling like if I have to add one word, I would say entitled.
Anyone else? I might start calling names.
I mean, on people, with their reaction to, well, when I was on the planning board in Rye, there was discussion about affordable housing. But people are definitely NIMBY about affordable housing. They don't want it. They view it as, people were saying things like, we don't want drugs and violence in our town. And I'm thinking, I don't know how they can confuse affordable housing with, they're confusing it with Section 8 housing, for example, in a town like Chicago. And while you were talking, one of the things I thought about was changing the narrative on this in our towns. And having, the one thing that people believe other people, and they believe people that they like. So if we knew people in our towns that own businesses that could speak to this subject, it might change the narrative. I'm trying to spin this into a positive, not feed into that. When somebody says, okay, it's going to cause high crime's going to go up, right? Well, you don't even address the crime thing, because that's a non-starter, and it's an unrealistic thing anyway. You're dealing with with smoke. So I'm just wondering whether or not it would be a good idea to talk about what that means, what affordable housing means to employers and fellow employees. I mean, we have some very reputable large employers on the seacoast who have people who live in our town. And that's what we're talking about, our neighbors. We're talking about young families with children. Does that make sense?
Does. And I'd like to carry on that same theme by, I think we need to do a better job explaining the definition of what affordable housing is versus low-income housing. And I think that's where the confusion comes, and they automatically assume it's low-income housing, it's welfare housing, not affordable housing. And when you look at what affordable housing is versus in each community or region, a lot of people will still think that's not really affordable.
That's absolutely true, because we were recently reviewing a project that was going to give us some condominiums down Route 1, and it was going to be 25% workforce housing for sale. And so I asked what was, at 100% median income, what was the actual value of a 2-bedroom condo? And it was over $400,000, which is not really affordable, even at workforce housing levels. So the affordability of the market, as a real estate attorney and a city councilor, I mean, I see it every day. The affordability of the market is the issue. And not to go into another realm, but one of the things we're looking at is how can we take city-owned property and give it to nonprofit developers to give us long-term, truly affordable housing. I see that as the only way we're going to get housing, and in short periods of time.
Curious to hear from Peter and Leanne. If there was one word to describe housing in your community, what would it be?
Scarce.
Hmm.
Especially apartments. I can't really put this in one word. I mean, it's just, as I said before, it's single family predominantly, and the zoning, like so many other places, is set up push that and low density. And we're working on changing our density requirements, but as far as apartments go or multifamily dwelling units, it's scarce and not getting better.
Right. And I think one word for Hampton Falls is expensive.
Mhm.
I'm gonna say elderly. It's what seems to be going up here.
Hmm,
A lot of
interesting.
elderly housing. And, you know, it probably has something to do with our ordinance. You know, we have an elderly open space ordinance, which allows the cluster housing. And I don't know why developers choose one over the other, but lately that's what we're seeing.
Sarah, I just would like to, I already said what my one word was, but I know that the town of Rye just did a complete reevaluation on assessments. And due to COVID, we had people moving here from New York, Connecticut, California, and they were paying on the average 40% up to 100% over market rates. And so assessments across the board have gone up. The phones have been ringing nonstop in the tax clerk's office and the assessing department. I own 2 properties in Rye, and the little ranch that we bought several years ago next door to my house as a rental went up more than my house itself. So we are building some workforce housing, and an individual, I don't want to say who it is, who used to say what Jackie Grote said, saying when she was a chair, saying, oh, you know, it's going to be crime ridden and was confusing it with Section 8, now qualified and purchased one of those homes as a workforce employer and afforded that. So he's living in workforce and just years ago was associating it with Section 8. And what I'm seeing, and I don't know what your next question is, but I see developers, and I've seen it in the Portsmouth Herald, and I've listened to some of the Portsmouth talks. They get around the loopholes, and we tried to change the quantity going up to the number of workforce housing in Rye, because we saw all of a sudden all these developers were coming to us out of the blue and seeing it as a way to get, you know, multiple projects. And I put it before our town attorney, and I said, let's up the number. And I got shot down by our selectman's rep, who's on the planning board, saying that's just random. And I think you're going to lose the momentum. And I'm questioning whether to bring it up again this year, because there's not much land to be built in Rye. And if they are going to build these big, like 40 units, 60 units, we should capitalize on the workforce housing. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, so my next questions were about, you know, is housing a priority in your community? And how are you seeing that across discussions from, you know, land use boards to committees? You know, I know it can be a challenge to balance different priorities within a community, but, you know, has it seemed like housing has started to ripple to the top of those conversations? And then, you know, sort of separate from that, but a second part is, you know, how has your municipality seen recent housing development proposals, and how has the reaction or perceptions, you know, been from the boards and also the public when those proposals have come in, and whether, you know, from the range of workforce affordable to market rate housing proposals? Kim, go ahead.
I disconnect. The boards are welcoming it. The public, oh, too much. I mean, we had a visioning session in November, and overwhelmingly, the public is coming out saying, too much. When are you going to stop it? We need a moratorium. You can't allow this. And it's the NIMBY effect. So the public doesn't want it, but the boards do.
That's why I was recommending you know, the people who are the issue are the homeowners. Because I know the planning board has been, and the zoning board has been pushing for this for a long time. We've tried to, I mean, just to do one of the things that we wanted to do, our first attempt was, which was a while ago, was this cluster housing, and 20% of the units had to be affordable. Well, you know, it hardly makes a dent when you build 20 units and you've got 4, that, I mean, it's a tiny, tiny dent. So sometimes I think we have a lovely development in Rye called White Birch, which was for elderly housing, affordable elderly housing. And I was just there this past weekend, and at the time, there was a lot of concern about it, but it's lovely. I mean, the people that live there are happy. It's a community within itself. It's really quite nice. And, you know, I'm really proud to have been part of that. And sometimes I think that if people saw that as an example, you know, we're not talking about, you know, skyscrapers here, but it's very hard to, people can't envision what that looks like. And there's certainly a certain amount of people who don't want to have a workforce. I mean, for some reason, they also don't want children in school, right? Instead of considering your house, in fact, there was the other thing I was thinking about while this call was going on. My property taxes, to me, are an investment in the community. They're an investment in the asset of the community. And the asset of the community is the land, the schools, the buildings. And why would I not want to continue to invest in those assets? Which is another way of turning this whole conversation around about how to present this to people. But, you know, I really think that's where we have to, and if we want to make Rye a test case, I'd help with that, and not until after the election, though, right? So I can't, I have no more time, but I would do something after the election, because I think this is a very important, Rye is not the only town that's having this issue, right? This is not an issue. So if we want to make a test case of Rockingham County, where we have this whole conversation, we really have to go at the entry level and talk to the people in the town.
Yeah. In Hampton,
Beth is, oh, Karen, go ahead.
Hampton Falls, we're not actually seeing the lack of housing as a top priority right now, but we don't have many employers. So we're not seeing our employers looking for employees. We know it's a greater regional problem, but when it comes down to us, we don't have like the sewer or water infrastructure. So lots can't support multifamily housing. You know, we have a 2-acre minimum right now, which is large, but if it were to go down smaller, we still have to leave septic areas. And so that's where our rub sort of comes. We can't improve or increase our density much until we can increase or improve the infrastructure.
Yeah, so Karen, I just got a comment that it looks like some folks are having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. So if you don't mind just speaking up, but it sounds like kind of to summarize, infrastructure is a challenge in Hampton Falls. So, you know, even though it's not necessarily as prevalent of a top priority due to the, you know, lack of larger employers in the community, it's still something that's being discussed, but that there's sort of some limitations from a infrastructure and trying to get that density.
Right. It's if you don't have sewer, a multifamily is difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And go ahead.
Well, everyone knows I have a lot to say on the topic. The city council, when we took office in January, we set our goals, and one of them was the affordability of not just housing, but several different areas of Portsmouth. The Ruth Lewin Griffin Place that just opened at the beginning of June is a model for what we need to replicate in other parts of our city. So we are working with that, but the Portsmouth Housing Authority can only really do one project a year. So I'm starting to look out to find other developers that are used to using housing tax credits and doing development like that, because I'd be happy to bring some of them in. We're trying to also help a nonprofit right now and help them build a new office and shelter. We're, you know, trying to find all of these different ways that we can help to expand on our housing. We're also, so as the chair of the land use committee, we're also right now about to start pulling out some red lines of our ADU laws. We would like to try to make, attached ADUs where you're not changing the actual structure, it's just within it, be something that somebody could get without having to get a conditional use permit. There are some stumbling blocks probably along the way to get that, but that's one of the things that, one of the many things that we're looking at. So, city-owned property, what can we develop? There'll be a longer-term plan now that we own the community campus to try to figure out whether or not housing should be a part of that facility. But yeah, I agree. People don't want to see skyscrapers. If anyone screams about building height, it's in the city of Portsmouth. We have a very vocal community here that likes to be heard a lot. So, we're doing what we can with what we have. The question is whether or not it will happen quick enough. And that becomes a real, thing that we need to do. So yeah, I've always thought this is a great forum with the regional pact because if you have land that might be on the border of Portsmouth and you might think, well, it'd be a really good place to have some affordable housing, let's talk, because we probably could find a way to get it there.
And as far as sort of community buy-in, how has that been seen in Portsmouth? So you mentioned like the height is something that people.
Yeah, they don't like density in all respects. As far as I get, we're more dense than most people, but they still, the people who live in some of the densest neighborhoods thinks we shouldn't be that dense. And there's this argument behind, wanting more parking to the environmentalists who want taller buildings and more green space. There's competing interests and they all come at you at the same time. But in the end, we just have to make the decisions that's best for the bulk of the city. So yeah, it becomes a difficult conversation because I can say one argument's going to come to me and then another one comes to me, and we can't make them all work, but we can do our best to try to get there. So by looking at zoning and looking at, property that we own and trying to get affordable housing mixed in. I mean, the Portsmouth Housing Authority is soon supposed to come out with their results of their Portsmouth housing assessment. And I know that, some of the initial thoughts were that maybe we haven't actually grown our housing. We've actually lost housing. I'm like, how is that possible? I mean, for the last 9 years on planning board, I know we approved hundreds of new units. So there really should be an increase. I mean, we just added West End Yard. That's 250 rental units plus another 23 townhouses. So, we've added a lot of housing. So I'm curious to find out if how much more we really need and how we can expand. It's a battle.
Yeah.
And it's a crisis. That's what everyone needs to understand. And I think it's getting there. Whether or not they're willing to let us do it is the question. But it is a crisis and we plan on treating it like it is one.
And along similar lines, so moving a little bit into sort of talking about challenges and opportunities, what are some of the major factors or constraints that folks are seeing on housing development? Have there been proposals that have come in that, working with the boards, the land use boards, planning board or zoning board, and the developer, you just haven't been able to make it work. And, for whatever reason, are folks seeing that the constraints are, as Karen mentioned, infrastructure and density, or is it land availability, or is it that you're just not, developers aren't necessarily coming to the table with workforce housing proposals, or all you're seeing is 55 plus subdivisions? What are those constraints and limitations that folks are seeing?
In Portsmouth, it's cost. They can't afford to give us workforce housing because land costs are so high and development costs are so high. So that's one of our biggest issues, at least here.
I would say in rural towns like Kingston, there's no incentive. Developers are going to go for whatever they can get, and if they can get single families, high per unit cost development, they will. There's no, we don't have any real built-in incentives, except for, of course, more older places where, because of the lack of school costs involved, they've given a density break and other things. But hopeful that maybe the new law that requires the same density bonuses for workforce housing as were for the elderly housing might have an effect, but I doubt it, because I don't think that's going to provide enough financial incentive.
Has Kingston seen quite a bit of, 55 plus or elderly housing since
Yeah, I think
implementing?
Kingston, Hampstead, we've all had both assisted living and one of those, but there's at least 3 other 55 plus, 4 of them, I guess, including one that hasn't been built yet but was approved. Yeah, I mean, we saw it, and we created the zones for it, and they were snatched up. I think there's a lot of profit, even if you don't sell it as a for-profit type of a situation. That there's a lot of profit there.
Anyone else for challenges and constraints, big factors that they're seeing?
We haven't had any applications even come forward or developers even asking about it.
Interesting. And go ahead, Leanne.
I was just gonna say, what I'm hearing from the builders is the cost of materials. I know the cost of land is high, but the cost to actually build the house once they subdivide is a challenge.
That's what I was just gonna say. One of the things about Rye is the cost of the land is high. And why not build a house that you can get $3 million for? You know what I mean? But then you start to think about responsible. I'm trying to use this word all the time now. Responsible capitalism. Right? Responsible capitalism. And I'm just wondering if there's some way. Being in the legislature, I always look for ways of helping with affordable housing. And I don't know if this has ever been done, but just to help towns who want to be able to help towns or help give owners some sort of benefit to sell their land to a developer for affordable housing. Is there some way you can give them a tax credit or something so that it makes it easier or more viable, more financially? I don't know enough about how that would work, but I'm just tossing it out there. But I think Leanne's comment about the cost of, and some people just have more money than they know what to do with, right? And they seem to, they buy property and then they want to build this house, and then the builder's going to build it for them, obviously. And so builders are more, and I don't know, it's really difficult right now to find anybody to do anything in your house because the builders are all busy. And why would they want to chase a community project, let's call it that, over a private?
And we talked a little bit, it came up, I think Beth made a comment about balancing, there's constantly sort of housing development and then sort of balancing that, natural resource protection. You hear it in a lot of our communities of that preservation of rural character. Have there been conversations within your communities, our communities, of sort of figuring out how to balance those two? They can sometimes feel competing, right? Whether or not they actually are is a discussion to be had. But have those conversations been happening? And if so, what has been sort of the result?
Well, I'd agree with the comment made earlier that the conversations are happening at the planning board level. and there's support there for the most part. It doesn't get beyond those doors. There's no we've been able to put through a couple of changes, density changes and things to enable apartments to be built. But quite frankly, those are passing only because they're part of a large streak of zoning changes that get recommended by the planning board. And I don't think people really take the time to look into them. You know, if there's something that was really egregious, you know, to their sensibilities, they would probably there would be an uproar and a lot of paper letters to the editor, but type of thing. But so I think any major plan to increase the amount of affordable housing, yeah, I think there would be a lot of negative interest, put it that way.
And I think Rye mentioned that they'd had recently a visioning session to try to bring, you know, some public comments in. Have other communities thought about doing some visioning work or other ways to, you know, sort of like what Jackie was saying, shifting the narrative of how do we cross that bridge of, you know, helping people understand the difference of what we're talking about, that, you know, we're talking about workforce housing, which is really for those people like our teachers and, you know, folks who are living and working in our community. And it's a challenge, right? When you're coming from a land use board perspective, you know, trying to sort of do what is going to be good for the community in the long run, but also balancing those community perceptions.
I've always believed that education is a huge portion of that. The question is, how do you educate them? And that's always been the toughest thing. Like how do we have that conversation or put that information out there in a way that's understandable and they'll absorb it? And I think it's a challenge every day to figure that out.
It's really interesting hearing from you all that there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between, you know, land use boards and the general public, you know, that the boards are seeming to sort of understand what the needs of the community are and how they're changing, but that, you know, on the public perception side, there's a little bit of a disconnect.
Ironically, since we're on computers, while we were chatting, New Hampshire Municipal Association just had a municipal grant programs for a seminar for their Invest New Hampshire Municipal Grant Programs for affordable housing. So it's working its way in, as we know, in the circles. There's a lot of talk about it on the news, and I think till it actually hits home when an organization I work with has been trying to hire a couple of people, and the first round of interviews, they offered the job, and the applicant couldn't find a place to live and had to reject the job, and anywhere within commuting distance, and we're having that problem with the town. We try to find new people to work for the town, and it's tough. People are going to be the library staff and the town, you know, town admin staff, because people aren't volunteering for that anymore. Obviously, these are paid positions, but you know, you can't offer what the private sector is doing right now. But until the whole general attitude changes, I think until that starts hitting the people who can't hire a plumber or, you know, anything else, because they've all had to move out of state, that's going to be when finally people realize that, you know, it's some programs are going to have to happen to make it work.
I could share an observation that's kind of related on how to get the message out. We had the age-friendly community forum, which most of the people there were the same community people that show up for a lot of things. But there was this one young couple that showed up that were new to town, and they garnered quite a bit of attention because of their struggle to find affordable housing in the area. So it was interesting to see how interested everybody, the typical naysayers that say, well, cluster development, water resources, those types of things, were then also very interested in what this young couple had to say about, a starter home and starting out, and how they want to be part of the community, but they had a hard time finding one. So maybe the narrative needs to change, but maybe the voice needs to change too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
The last thing I'd bring forward, and this probably doesn't affect the entire region, but it certainly affects those of us that are close to the seacoast, and that's short-term rentals. They ruin the affordability of housing on a regular basis. And if we're not careful on the legislative side, we could have some serious issues there in regulating how much they are able to be, in our single family neighborhoods and in our case, our less dense areas.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, are
Well,
other communities having conversations about short-term rentals?
Yeah, it needs to be part of the housing conversation, because short-term rentals is, unless properly regulated, is going to cause us issues.
Yeah. I can see more so in your area, of course.
Yes.
I mean, here, everybody's like, wow, that's a great idea. People can make more money, but that's a definite negative. Yeah.
It is when hotels or large corporations start buying them up and renting them out as executive rentals and for parties and everything else. And then, you don't have that fabric of a neighborhood that some of our neighborhoods actually have. I mean, I'm all for it in the downtown core where you already have hotels and all of that. That's the business. But when you're running businesses in single family and more rural neighborhoods of a city, that becomes a really big problem. And it makes so much money that makes the value of the houses all go up more. Not like we don't already have that problem all on our own.
And those are the same people that want to come in and divvy up a 6-acre lot that they don't understand the access and wetlands and all that, those types of things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is Rye seeing? I think we still have Rye people on. Is Rye having conversation? Do they already?
Kim had to go help a client, so
I'll ask her when she comes back. And so, folks, Peter brought up workforce a little bit, but are those conversations happening as well? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they're happening in Portsmouth, and I know it sounded like Hampton Falls not so much, but in Fremont or in Rye or Portsmouth, are businesses coming to, is it prevalent? Is it something that we're seeing where businesses are saying, hey, we, maybe we need to relocate because we can't necessarily find the workforce, and not only the bodies, but qualified workforce?
I don't know. I will keep my ears open.
I know it's definitely a problem in Portsmouth. The workforce has to live so far, especially when you're talking hospitality. They drive so far to come to work. It's gotten a little bit ridiculous.
So shifting gears a little bit, I'm going to start to slowly wrap us up, but I have a couple more questions. So as far as sort of development trends, so my two questions are, we've sort of touched on this a bit, but what type of development, from I guess, overall development and then specifically housing have your communities been seeing, in the past 5 years? And are trends of types of development, whether it be, if it's housing, is it, types of housing as far as multifamily or smaller houses, are you starting to see, and does it seem like that's shifting at all, or does it seem like it's been consistent, in recent years of what you've been seeing for development?
Hampton Falls, what we've seen is larger single family homes that are single family on a larger lot being subdivided and a like home being built. So that has happened in a range of neighborhoods, whether it's a larger home and they subdivide off the extra 2 acres and put a similar larger home, the same in smaller neighborhoods. So it's like for like, but I would say we've probably only increased, and I've only worked for this town for about a year, but over the past few years, I'm going to say no more than 10 housing units total.
I mean, I can give you for the last 5 years, obviously we require mixed use in the downtown area. So, but there's been a lot more housing. I can tell you one condominium building on Bridge Street has been there now for probably 4 or 5 years. And it's just recently finally rented out its commercial space. It's been empty all this time. But the developers know that they can charge enough money for the condominium units. They make enough, it doesn't matter when that space ends up going out, right? We finally had our really probably first large single family home subdivision that's just gotten started off of Beverly Hill Road. It's just behind the cemetery off of 33 area. And that's technically it's 100 acres, but a huge portion of it's going into conservation. It's a lot of wetlands. So they're doing basically a PUD much closer to the road behind the cemetery there. So that's going to be 50 to 60 homes. I can't remember exactly, but those are single family homes. We had some townhouse developments, some single family homes, another single family home off of Banfield Road. And we've had the West End Yards, 2 big multifamily apartment buildings. So we have a mix of it, but I definitely, talking again about the Portsmouth Green, I mean, they're tearing down a brand new movie theater to put in condominiums because housing is much more the way to go than, a movie theater.
What I've seen in Rye is that, as I mentioned earlier, people are now realizing we have this workforce housing and it's their way to build condos because we technically don't allow apartments and apartment buildings in Rye. So what I'm seeing is 30 units, 40 units. I know that there's a piece that includes Greenland and Rye and they want to do 80 units. So I'm seeing stuff like that on the other side, and they're expensive. So these condos, I mean, 4 out of 30 or 4 out of 20, and it's just, even the workforce housings are $400,000, and that's just ridiculous. And then I'm seeing other things is people are taking the dregs of what's left out there for buildable lots, and they're merging 2 lots to try and get 20 housing units, and they're going from 8 to 1.4 mil. And they're really squeezing out the ranches are no longer staying. That's why we bought the ranch right next door to us. Our neighbor went into Webster at Rye, and he had always said that he would sell it to us and we kept it as is. We just did cosmetics because you need more variety. You need some of these ranches instead of some of these mega homes.
As far as applications go to the planning board, we've had more since the uptick, had more commercial interest, but not housing commercial. We've had very few multi-unit housing requests, and I think it has to do with the availability. As you said, most of the buildable lots, the easily buildable lots, were sold and either built upon, or the other ones would require a lot of variances and wetlands regulations, workarounds, and things. It'd be quite expensive to develop those. So you're not going to see that go in as workforce housing or even as multi-unit condos or 55 housing. So I would say we have not seen an uptick in housing development requests.
Interesting. So I think we have another slide worth of questions that I'm looking at, but I think we mostly started talking already about sort of some solutions. A little bit. It's a tough nut to crack. So I'm just looking to make sure we hit all of my points. Sorry. I guess my last question is sort of, you know, Beth, you mentioned that Portsmouth has been working to try to, you know, as a city, provide land to developers for workforce housing and affordable housing. You know, I would consider that sort of an innovative solution. We know of some employers, Harmony Homes, that's providing housing for their employees, right? They're building housing that's specifically to house their employees in the region. You know, that's an innovative solution. There's obviously been a lot of conversation about accessory dwelling units and tiny homes. You know, those can be considered some type of solution. Are there other, I guess I'd call them sort of like those innovative or creative solutions or ideas that have, you know, come across your table that you've heard about, or that you're interested in learning a little bit more about how your community could pursue them? I'm curious, you know, we're hoping to include a lot of these sort of resources in our final housing needs assessment document. And I'm wondering if there are any that, you know, you guys have thought about or discussed that, but you're not really sure how to implement.
So I've looked into 79E and the housing opportunity zones, but unfortunately, I think we're at this point, I missed the boat on that one. If I had done it for the West End before the brewery buildings all got rebuilt, that would have been a great area to have taken advantage of that. And I just am having a hard time finding an area of our city that's in need of that kind of revitalization at this point. So looked at, I'm just having a hard time finding it really worth the time to keep going after it. One of the things that in our sort of 3-phase plan of changing our zoning, we're looking at, we're going to start looking at as soon as we're done the red lines of the ADUs, and that moves along. Of course, I see it at Land Use, City Council, and Planning Board, so I see it multiple times. We're going to start looking at our incentive program. So we have incentives now in our north end that allow them to build bigger, more dense properties if they give us workforce housing or community space. Every single developer has chosen community space. No one has given us workforce housing. So we need to tighten that up and find ways to do it. So it certainly would be fun to find out, you know, how insistent can we be? I know we can't force it. So the ways that we could say and truly incentivize, you know, how do we do that? And that's going to be one of the things we're going to be looking at this fall that we definitely could use some help on.
Interesting, yeah.
Any other ideas beyond that? Yeah, I'm game to listen to any innovative ideas. I mean, we have, you know, it's so funny. We actually did some focus groups for our ADU law. And so we reached out to a bunch of engineers and architects, people who regularly come through our land use boards. And I happened to moderate the architects, and they were so excited that we are asking their opinion. It was amazing how when you actually go out to some of those people, they're really excited that you want their opinion. And it is. And then I said to them, okay, tell me some other communities you guys work in that I could go look at what they've done and maybe they'll help us. And they're like, no, you're at the forefront. Like, you have the best already and you're trying to make it better. So I guess I was happy and sad all at the same time. I didn't get that sort of help I was looking for, but all right, so maybe we have to keep trudging our way forward and trying to figure out what works best. But just constantly looking at it is I think one of the big things. It's just we keep getting pressure about parking and about solar panels and about EV chargers. I mean, there's pressure just, and our staff is only so big and only so has so much capacity. So right now it's a capacity at sort of the staff level to try to get everything we want done. So, and you know, we're only in power for 2 years, so. It's a short period of time to get a lot done.
Yeah, and that's sort of another one of my questions was, you know, looking at your housing goals and your priorities, right? Do your regulations align with them? And, you know, if not, are you working towards that? And it sounds like Portsmouth is, but it's a uphill climb, right? It's a process, and, you know, it's not a quick fix to change a zoning ordinance or site plan regulations. So, Anyone else on the solutions front or just creative ideas? No, it's a tough question.
I did read an article that was a national article on how to address all these things. So one of them were to eliminate the idea of single family housing zones and make everything mixed use. They said eliminate parking regulations, that developers will, yeah, see Beth nodding on that one. I'm thinking, boy, that's because that's part of our ADU ordinance is that you've got to be able to provide enough off-street parking for your original unit and the ADU. And I have a tough time. I've got a sister who lives in Manhattan, and it's not exactly someplace you want to eliminate a requirement that developers put in parking, but it's been done in Buffalo and a bunch of other places, and they say it's been working. And I really have a tough time envisioning how that would work and how that helps. But I don't know if anybody else has seen the list of I think it was 5 or 6 easy steps you should take to help ease the housing crunch, and there's more municipally oriented as opposed to rural, but that was one of them. That was the one I wasn't sure how that would work.
Well, it's funny you say that, Peter, because the 2 top things that neighbors, because we also looked at abutters and neighbors of existing ADUs in our survey, and the top things were short-term rentals, the fear that somebody would make their ADU a short-term rental, and the other is parking. And as you know, Portsmouth has probably some of the largest conversations around parking that there probably is. I live in one of those many neighborhoods that is currently doing a pilot program for, permit parking to try to keep it from being taken away from the people who live there. But the funny part is then there's the West End yards, and you talk about parking. Well, so we have parking regulations, and yes, I agree. We probably need to take a look at them between downtown and outside of downtown. But they actually had to come back to us and ask for more parking, because after everyone actually moved in, they didn't have enough. They had the room to make more, but they had to come back for a site plan adjustment in order to do that. So, it all depends on who you talk to. You talk to the environmentalists, and they want us to cut out parking. We don't need so much parking. And so parking is just a conversation I feel like is part of every single day of my life. So that's why I laugh. I'm like, oh, parking again. Let's talk more about parking. Oh, I don't know how to solve the parking issue, but streamlining and ADUs. I mean, the other thing that actually would work for a place like yours, and something I think on a longer term we're going to look into here, but it was suggested to us because Seattle, Washington, I know it's pretty far away, but for detached ADUs, they actually have pre-approved plans. So if somebody comes and says, I want to build an ADU, and you say, there's sets of plans that the city's already pre-approved. You build one of these and you have, whatever the requirements are to build one of those, then you can, and nobody can say anything against it. So where you have larger lots and people might want to put in those smaller ADUs that are freestanding, might be something you want to look into for your area. We don't really have the room for most people to work on that, but it's something I think down the road we might consider.
Yeah, we do have attached ADUs permitted and detached, ADUs permitted. But there are restrictions, and parking was one of them. But the idea was obviously the state, when they changed the ADU ordinance, allowed a minimum of you couldn't make a minimum of fewer than 2 bedrooms, so that I think I got that worded right. Basically, that if you have a 2-bedroom ADU, it qualifies as a unit of workforce housing. And we've had quite a lot of requests, a lot for ADUs. People still come in to request because detached, you have a right to have an ADU built into your house, and you don't have to go any place outside of the building inspector. But for a detached ADU, we do have in a single family residential zone, it has to look like a garage or a barn or some other outbuilding, not so that it maintains the appearance of a single family residential area. And so we have to approve the design. But we've had people who still come in and they think in-law apartment and they're saying, well, this is just for my mother-in-law. I said, don't worry, you're allowed to build these things and you can rent them out to anybody you want. It's like,
Yeah.
it's that attitude upon the public is still that I'm doing something on the sly if I'm gonna try to rent it out.
Right, right. Well, we want them to rent them out. That's how we
I
get
know.
more affordable housing.
That's the idea. That was the idea behind the state
Yeah.
opening up the regs, was to get more affordable housing.
Right, right. Yeah, we don't allow any by right at this point, just because we have very tight neighborhoods and almost every lot's non-conforming. So no matter whether, if you have to put an addition to make it attached or not, we basically also have garden cottages, which are existing buildings that might be on your property. So there's a conversion of barns and, whether it be a, caretaker's cottage or whatever the case may be. So we've done some different things with ours, but yeah, it still needs more work.
So this has been a great discussion. I am gonna wrap it up just because I think I promised that these would only be 90 minutes. But thank you all for attending. So just as far as next steps go, as I mentioned, this session was recorded, so I'll summarize some of these notes and have them available for other folks to view. We have another session next, I believe, Thursday at 10 a.m. So if you do know of anyone who could not attend today and is interested, please feel free to forward the link along. I'll also be sending it out again, just as a reminder. Stay tuned. So the full summary reports of the 2 surveys that I presented will hopefully be published on our webpage early next week, as I mentioned. We will have our social service provider summary up shortly as well, hopefully in the coming weeks, I would say, hopefully by the middle of August. And that includes, housing authorities as well as folks who are assisting finding housing for folks who are, dealing with mental health issues, substance abuse, things like that. The populations that we maybe didn't capture as well in our community survey, or that I can say we likely did not capture as well in our community survey. Hopefully those populations will be represented a little bit better in that survey. And yeah, I think that's all I have. You all have my contact information. I will likely send a follow-up email as well with just a couple of the links that I mentioned. I can send the link to the video of the May event that was hosted with Extra Housing Advisory Committee, as well as the Workforce Housing Coalition. And I'll send the link to our project webpage and everything like that, just so folks can stay in the loop. But thank you all.
Thank you, Sarah.
Talk soon. Take care. Bye-bye.